I want to welcome Ed Robbins to the school and to this lecture hall, where in fact he has given many lectures in the last few years in his regular visits as an invited scholar working in the graduate school and in particular with the Housing and Urbanism program. Ed is going to be in the school until the end of this week, participating in a series of activities, giving lectures, participating in seminars and reviews, and is also conducting a workshop on social theory and design, which started last week and runs all through this week. Ed doesn't like introductions and doesn't like to be introduced, so that makes my job much simpler. He is going to tell you about his current work and interests. Tonight he's going to be talking about the challenges to housing architecture and housing design at the end of the century, and in particular present a sort of critique of current proposals, some new proposals about housing architecture. Proposals that, despite new, have the flavor of very old ideas and therefore the title of some old novelties. This is going to be the first of a series of public lectures organized by the Housing and Urbanism program under the title of Housing Debates, which will attempt to bring together, especially in the summer term, practitioners and academics to discuss the place of housing in current architectural and urban debates. In a sense, one could say that housing itself is an old novelty, has been central to most architectural and urban agendas for most of the century, but in recent years, for over a decade, in many countries, has become almost a non-issue, only to reappear again very strongly, almost with a sort of vengeance at the end of the century. And what the series will attempt to do is to take stock of where we are in the field of housing, what are the challenges to housing design, housing strategies, policy at the end of the century, what is new, if anything, in the field of housing. So we started the series with Ed Robbins, and I leave you with Ed. Yeah.
Okay, let me begin. Did you turn that off? I have a loud voice. I'm from New York, so I don't. Can you hear me in the back? No problem, right? Right? I once went to a course given by a very famous actor, and he told all the young actors the most important secret of stage acting, and that was to be heard in the last row. And if you can't be heard, then everything else is, well, anyways. No problem if you're from New York, though. Let me begin by reading a quote from Chester Hartman, which is apropos of what George was saying. And it's for a book, Good Housing Design, that just came out in the United States. And he says that the picture for affordable housing is grim, not only in the U.S., but throughout much of the world, with little hope for amelioration in the near future. What is worse, in the words of Neil Smith, is that, especially in regard to discussions about the homeless, there's been a shift in the rhetoric by many academics and scholars and journalists and politicians from a sympathetic, albeit often patronizing stance, in Neil Smith's words, to a more brazen indictment of homeless people, not just for their predicament, but for their larger social ills. This discourse about the homeless, I think, parallels discussions about low-cost housing and low-income housing, even sometimes middle-income housing in general. There is less and less concern. There certainly is less and less investment in these issues. And there seems to be almost a complicity on the part of many intellectuals and many architects in regard to this issue. That is to say, the justifications for labor here or Clinton in the United States saying there's no money for welfare, while there is $2 billion for a millennial dome. What I'd like to talk about, but even as that goes on, it's interesting, what George said is true, that in many graduate schools of architecture, people are beginning to talk about housing again, albeit in somewhat indirect ways. In the United States, which I'll talk about a little bit, the most important place that discussion is going on is in the discussion about the new urbanism, which I'd like to raise, which I think is a new, old idea in many, many ways. I'm not going to talk today about why all this happened. I'm not going to talk about why there's been a kind of revanchist spirit vis-a-vis low-income housing and social welfare in general. Others do it, like Neil Smith, better than I can. What I would like to do tonight is to raise a number of issues that we need to confront in dealing with housing, be it low-cost or middle-class housing. I must say that I am not concerned with upper-class housing. I find the issue fundamentally boring. They can take care of themselves, in essence. What I would like to do also is to talk suggestively. So I'm going to sort of try to be broad and not particularly deep. Some people say that even if I were narrow, I couldn't be particularly deep, so being broad becomes the excuse. But I would like to deal with a number of different issues. And I would like to deal with them because I think we have to begin to rethink the ground rules for dealing with housing, be it low income or middle income. And so what I want to look at is a number of questions and issues. I have no answers yet, but I'd like to raise the issues themselves. There are 4 themes. I might not get to them all, but I'll mention them. The first theme is the extent to which so much architectural debate has and still revolves around a unidimensional set of proposals for housing, be it the modernist tower, the sites and services that were suggested for third world groups in the 1960s and 1970s, or the new urbanism today. I'll come back to that. But by that I mean, it is interesting that every generation creates someone who says, we have the answer. All the answers up to now are terrible. They all failed. We know the way. And I think that is one symptom and problem in dealing with issues of housing, and issues of housing particularly in the city. The second thing, I think, which is a new old idea, is the extent to which we have and still do place too much load on housing to achieve what it cannot possibly achieve. That is, creating stable families, creating good citizens, being the basis for the redevelopment and rescuing of the poor. Thirdly, I'd like to look at the way we have and still use certain assumptions about society to underwrite many of our notions about the residential environment. Specifically, I would like to look at the extent to which, I don't want to look at the extent to which, I want to look at the problem of continuing to base housing in notions of community and neighborhood. Not that it's necessarily all bad, but it is, in many ways, they are problematic, extremely problematic notions. And finally, if I have time, I would like to suggest that the problem of housing for architects is not the house. Never has been, never will be. House is a relatively easy thing to design. The problem for architects, and it's not so much that it's easy to design, is not the form that creates problems for people who live in it. The problem for architecture is the problem of the residential environment. So, having said that, let me begin with these 4 themes. Theme 1. Throughout the 20th century, while housing has been built in quite a varied form and style, and ideological justifications for those form and styles have differed, what is, as I've said, interesting is that every one of the major approaches have agreed that there is only one and only one proper approach to solving the problem of housing. This is true of SIAM. It's true of those who argued for participatory design when I first got into architecture. It's true for those, as I said, who suggested sites and services in the third world. And it's true today for the new urbanists. I always find it interesting that the new urbanists constantly tell us that everything that came before was problem and should be completely denied. Let me do an aside, and this is where I'm going to show my slides quickly. Mine is basically a world of words, not slides. But what's most depressing about these approaches, these singularizing approaches, these unidimensional approaches, is that they belie the richness of the variety of work that is out there by architects on a daily basis in all sorts of places. And I'm going to show you slides mostly from the United States, in fact, almost predominantly from the United States, doing lots of different things in lots of different contexts. So for me, the problem is not the architects doing the housing. There's a lot of stuff out there. For me, the problem are the intellectuals and the architectural critics and the architectural movement makers who are essentially hiding that range of work, all in the name of a particular approach. And I think it's important to be reminded of this because those various approaches should be making it into our schools as they should have been making it into our schools years ago. Does anybody know the book by Paul Osmond called Done Roman? Paul Oliver, excuse me. Paul Oliver. Excuse my age. I have aphasia and bordering on all sorts of memory loss. He writes about being in school in the 50s, where he learned to reject the housing that he loved in the name of modernism, because he was told by instructors that you couldn't be happy in such housing. Which is a very fascinating thing because, you know, architecture students come in and knowing that they've been happy for 25 years, all of a sudden realize they haven't been happy all those 25 years. Because a movement tells them that that is so. So let's look at some of the slides and some of the variation, and then go back to the discussion of these singular solutions. I always screw this up. I've lectured here a lot, and I've never gotten the slides right. So, all right. Here's the problem. Here's the problem beginning. The London East End on the left side, and a New York tenement. These are late 19th century houses. Housing was a problem, but I want to say something very important here about the singular solutions. Housing was always seen as something of supposed to hold a load that it could not conceivably hold. From very early on, the ills of the working class, crime, instability of the family, were often blamed on the labyrinthine streets, the crowdedness, the overcrowding conditions. Even someone as knowledgeable as Frederick Engels, who should have known better, wrote continually about the danger of the labyrinthine streets of East London and Manchester and places and what they did to the working class. But from very early on, there were some very interesting, and that's where we're going to see the variety of solutions. This, on the left, I don't know if everybody knows this one. It's by Tony Garnier in Lyon, France. This on the right is a Peabody Trust building. Perfectly adequate. This was built, what, 50 years ago and still works? And this was probably built about, I'm not sure, about 50 years ago, maybe longer, and still works. But if you look at them, these things today in the recent discourses break every principle known to contemporary theorists of housing, doesn't it? You'd never get something like this from the new urbanists. My God. There's space between the houses. This is a kampong in Jakarta. I bring this up because this is a very successful, this is an early a solution to third world housing, which has worked very well in Jakarta. It is constantly brought up by people who lecture about the third world as a model of how to proceed in designing third world housing and third world residences in dense areas. It did succeed, but it's a model that I would argue is completely non-replicable. It worked once, it will probably never work again. It worked in Jakarta. It certainly wouldn't work in northern climates, as you note, among other things. Here now we go into the new solutions. This is the new urbanism in America. Does anybody know where this is? This is Kentlands in Maryland. Kentlands in Maryland is always brought up by the new urbanists as one of their great successes. I will show you it's not a success. It was paid for by Kmart and exists because it's next to a large supermarket on a major highway. But it is a viable, I don't want to put new urbanism entirely, it is a viable form of housing for some people. As a friend of mine explained, it's wonderful housing for people who don't like taking care of front or backyards because all the green spaces are taken care of by the Kentland Corporation. This, of course, on the left is Seaside. That is the artist quarters in Seaside. On the right is a Seaside wannabe. This is the new urbanism when the architects ain't so hot. Remember that. Okay? I'm going to go through this very quickly because this is, what is this? This is Memphis. This is Harbor Town in Memphis, another new urbanist community. I want you to look not only at the housing and the housing solutions. Much of it is unexceptional. It's not that it is bad housing. And I want you to make that clear. It is that it is not, as we shall see, the only answer, as the new urbanists argue. And it cannot do what the new urbanists claim. Some more new urbanist community. Crawford Street in Pittsburgh. Crawford Street's very interesting because Crawford Street was done by an architect who didn't know he was a new urbanist until they discovered him. Now he's a major new urbanist. And this is San Jose, California. This is what happens when new urbanism runs amok, in my mind. One of the things we have to remember, though, is that when you get into singular solutions, when you think about housing as one way, you forget the richness of housing. This is a very interesting diagram of all the different housing types in the United States. I mean, that's a lot of housing types. And yet, when we look at the palette of the new urbanists, or we look at the palette of the modernists, or we look at the palette of the participatory architects, each one of them takes a very small slice and says that's the answer. People have had multiple answers to multiple contexts in multiple situations. We have to get away from these singular answers. And to a great extent, outside the schools and outside intellectual discussions, we have. And these I'm going to go through a number of different wonderful, successful, low-income housing projects, mixed-income housing projects in various parts of the United States. This is, do you really want to know the names of these places? I can give them to you afterwards. You do. It's architects, got to know the names. This is the YMCA Village in Redmond, Washington. This is the Parkview Commons in San Francisco. I want you to look, what I like about Parkview Commons, a number of these, is the concern with the residential environment and the conventionality of the housing. This is Himan Hinnu Terrace in Oakland. We're moving in a different direction. This is 555 Ellis Street in San Francisco. By the way, if we go through them, the first one was 20 units to an acre. The second was 44 to an acre. This one is 122 units to an acre. Slightly more urban. This is the Frank G. Marr Community Housing in Oakland. 55 families per acre and 270 units for seniors per acre. So seeing people having different sets of needs. This is 2101 Turk Street in San Francisco. 201 to 251 units per square acre. And all of these are housing that are working. That's why I'm showing them. This is St. John's Hospital. This is an example of housing which often doesn't work. It was done when a hospital wanted an area where a lot of low-income people were living, and the people, this is in Santa Monica, the people fought back, so the hospital said, we will move you into better housing. And they actually did it. The United States has a long history of people promising to move people, and of course, they don't get moved. This is mutual housing in Brooklyn, New York, which is 54 units to the acre. This is Melrose Park in Bronx. This is the one that Clinton went to visit to show that he was concerned with public housing. This is Tent City in Boston, which is 89 units to the acre. This is near where I live. It's considered one of the more successful pieces of public housing. It was initially a disaster. Does anybody know the book by Paul Goodman called After the Planners? A very famous book in its day. This is the result. This is what happened 15 years after the big battles. Nobody who lives there was part of the original group that fought to keep it from being built. It is mixed income housing. It works architecturally, I think, in Boston. It has both very expensive and very low-income housing in it. It has some significant problems, though, socially, which nobody ever talks about. And then this is one of the more successful mixed-income communities in the country, Langham Court in the south end of Boston, built by a community development group. Quite a successful, quite a good piece of work. Both of them, by the way, Tent City and this were done by the same architects, Goody Clancy. All right, that's my pictures for today. Can we have the lights? All right. Now, I think that these slides show that there are people doing a lot of different types of housing for low-income people. And I chose housing for low income to show a variety within a type, a concern. Yet the new urbanists, who are very much in control of the debate about housing in the United States and have even gotten to the point where Henry Cisneros, who was our now indicted ex-cabinet head of housing and urban design, really effectively based all new projects to a great extent on new urbanist principles, plus a number of other financial principles, which I'm not going to talk about here. I can answer questions if you want to know. And that's because the new urbanists really basically have promised and say they have the solution, the way to reintegrate dwelling, working, schooling, worshiping, recreating, to put an end to the hardships imposed by the automobile, and to recreate for the city neighborhood and community in our cities by, they say, designing small-scale, low-rise residential environments of about 5,000 people. I'll come back to it. There are a number of significant problems with this. But what I find fascinating about it, does anybody remember Thamesmead? My generation knows Thamesmead. Young people have never heard of it. Has anybody seen Clockwork Orange? That's Thamesmead. They filmed it in Thamesmead. Well, let me read you in 1969 what the Greater London Council's architects wrote about Thamesmead, by the way, which in one way I'd like to congratulate, because in today's terms it was one project that would have cost $900 million for one project. And that's extraordinary, that people were investing in housing in that way. It's just sad that they invested in this singular way of doing housing, and thereby giving the right the excuse as to why you shouldn't invest in housing. They said in 1969, to prevent Thamesmead, and this is a direct quote, to prevent Thamesmead from becoming a dormitory area, a complete environment will be provided with employment, shops, and recreation, and entertainment centers close at hand. A sense of community, they said, they went on to say, can best be achieved in a compact development like Thamesmead by linking areas which might be otherwise separated neighborhoods by spines of flats. Now, I didn't have a slide of Thamesmead, but does anybody know what Thamesmead looked like? It has nothing to do with the new urbanism. It is the complete opposite of the new urbanism. And yet, two groups of people, each knowing they have the answer, and this is the answer, make the same exact claims. Now, there are two possibilities. There are more than two possibilities, but there are at least two possibilities. First is the possibility, which is probably real, that two solutions can achieve the same goals. Second possibility is that both are aiming higher than they ought to, which leads me to theme 2. Throughout the 20th century, just as there have been these endless singular solutions, what's interesting is the extent to which these singular solutions have been associated with issues of social engineering and social and cultural benefit of people in society. And I would argue that this is one of the great problems that housing confronts, and has always confronted in the 20th century, the attempt to make more of housing than one can possibly make of it. Over the last 70 or 80 years, actually probably the last 100 years, correct me if I'm wrong, people have argued that providing housing for those who would otherwise be homeless or housed inadequately would better society by creating a more stable community, by creating more stable families, and creating economic sustainability. These are not new arguments. We've had these arguments over and over again. The question is, can they? And I would say no. Housing might be helpful in some instances to create some participatory involvement, to get people more actively involved politically. Michael Piatok, an architect of a number of the houses there, when he designs low-income housing, always brings the residents together to demand more than the city or HUD or the state will give them, because he sees housing as a way to get people actively involved in creating a better world for themselves. He does not see the design of the house as doing anything for them other than providing a nice house. But he sees housing, if people are properly organized, as an opportunity to bring people together, to fight together, to confront City Hall. The problem with that is that it works sometimes, and Michael has many successful cases where communities have gotten wonderful artwork and things that they may not have gotten before. And it has, in many instances, created political force in the local community. But while using housing to organize people in this way may bring people together who are otherwise underrepresented, and it may, in some instances, bring progressive involvement with other people, because in San Francisco, some of the CDCs have really reached out and tried to help communities where housing is bad. It also does the opposite. For every CDC that reaches out and tries to build a better world, there's a CDC, and a low-income CDC, that creates a NIMBY. You know what an NIMBY is? Not in my backyard. In other words, that turns in on itself and says, we got it, we want to keep it. George was just telling me this in Brazil, where they're doing a major plan, and the favelas, which were very outreaching for many, many years, now they're building nice houses, and people are saying, can we build walls around them? Can we keep these emigres out? This happens all over the world. So that there's a balance here. Housing may bring people together, but it also can separate people in very, very extreme ways. It can also be used to create ties between different communities and also be used to divide communities. In Boston right now, when I do work with community groups in Boston, there's a major turf war going on between two community groups. One, the group that built that last house you saw, Langham Court, wanted to build more housing of a similar kind and wanted to expand its definition of community. Remember, CDCs are organizations, and they need to expand to survive just like everybody else. Another group, a very small group, called Madison Park, is just trying to get its foot in the door. Well, Northeastern University, which wanted dormitory housing in the spot where the South End, what's called SNAP, the people who built Langham Court wanted to build housing, went to Madison Park and said, if you ally with us and allow us to build dormitories, we'll build you a few low-income housing units. So there's a war on who is going to get that property. And Northeastern is very deliberately using Madison Park to fight a much more powerful CDC who it doesn't want in its neighborhood. Do you follow what I'm saying? So these political involvements, they are a good thing, but not always. You've got to know the context. You've got to be aware of what's going on. Housing may also be used to, as it has done in Langham Court, to bridge higher income and lower income people and to have them live cooperatively together. And in Langham Court it works. But in Columbia Point, the place that is also in Boston, also designed by Goody Clancy, they'll tell you that it works, but no, it doesn't work. There are tremendous, very difficult problems and tensions. One of the most important tensions is the people from the lower income communities like being out at night. And the kids like to be out at night. And the kids like to have friends come in. People from upper middle class backgrounds do not like people on the streets at night in the United States. They find it very threatening. And they find most young males, particularly black young males, very, very threatening. It has led to curfew rules and has led to very, very bitter fighting on the part of the higher and lower income residents about what is appropriate behavior, because of certain kind of both class and racist attitudes on the part of the upper middle class groups that are there. So yes, you can have successful mixed income housing, but you can also have very ugly kinds of outcomes because of the attempt to do it. I don't know when it succeeds and when it doesn't. I think it succeeds. In Langham Court, it succeeded because they knew. One of the things I loved about Langham Court is the people who organized it knew the limits of what you could do with housing. They didn't assume just by building nice housing that things would come together. That, in fact, they thought this out with all the residents before they ever built the damn thing, and they got the people to talk who were going to go into it to understand what the ground rules would be. Because they understood that housing couldn't solve the problem. That housing plus management plus thinking plus dialogue could possibly solve the problem. And it's always, they're very, very aware of the fact that it's a constant balance, and they've got to be very actively involved in maintaining this balance. But more crucially, I think the issue is, and it's something we have to constantly recall as architects and planners, housing cannot bring stability to those whose position in society and economy is precarious. It cannot create community where there is none. It can't even create more sustainable neighborhoods or less traffic. Let me look at this very quickly, just in terms of the new Urbanist Claims, because they're the latest group making claims of what they can do. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but there isn't a single new urbanist project that has succeeded in the United States. So when the new urbanists come over here and tell you about how successful they are, they're not successful. They have sold housing. And in the case of Disney, which is really not new urbanist, it's a large corporate, and the scale of it is entirely different. That's celebration. Most new urbanist communities do not have the downtown shopping centers that they claim. They do not have work within a pedestrian, walk away. They do not have grocery stores within a pedestrian walk away. Why? Because you can't do it. Do you know in the United States how many people it takes to sustain a grocery store of reasonable size? Anybody offhand know? A small shopping mall, a small one, not a big one. Just little corner with a big like a supermarket, like a small Sainsbury's and a. Anybody have any wild idea how many people it takes? you're getting there. 250,000 people. It's a lot of people. And these whole communities that are supposedly based on 5,000 people are supposed to maintain these sort of shopping. Well, they don't. Not even Seaside, by the way, which has something of a downtown, really is succeeding economically on the basis of its residents. It's succeeding because it's a big tourist site. Architects from all over come to see it, and other people. And that's really that's how it's succeeding economically downtown, and it's not even entirely complete. Furthermore, there's more and more evidence to suggest that even if you could put jobs and shopping in an area, there's no reason that people would use it. Robert Cervero, who's done a study, Severo, has done a study of places where jobs are adequate to the people in the community. And he finds out that in California, where that exists, 2/3 of the people of each community shift around. So 2/3 of the people who work in the communities come into the community, 2/3 leave to go work someplace else. I mean, why anybody would ever think that you could create a world in which people would live near their work in present-day society is beyond me. But these are dreams that have gone on since, what, Corbusier, Howard. It's a constant dream in the building of housing that we're going to do this. These are not new ideas. These are old ideas, and they continually fail, and yet we keep bringing them up. It's a really serious and dangerous thing. The other thing is, think about it. What happens if they could succeed? One of the things I did do, I thought about it when I thought about the new urbanism. Do you know how many there are over 2,000 religious denominations in the United States. The question I had of Andreas Dewani when he came is, are you going to put 2,000 churches in each community? How are you going to choose who gets what church? How are you going to choose where the Episcopal Church goes, where the Catholic Church goes, where the synagogue goes? And let's say you could build these things and they worked. Think of this. If you built in a city of 2 million people, a metropolitan region of 2 million people, on the basis of new urbanist principles, you have 400 communities of 5,000 people. That's 400 schools, 400 swimming pools, 400 football fields, 400 tennis courts, 400... And you begin to see the absurdity of it. Go look at the numbers of how many places like this towns of 2 million people have, and you'll find that it ain't 400 in most instances. It's a lot less than that. Couldn't sustain it. All right? Yet people keep coming up with these ideas. Why? I think it's a very sad thing. I don't think the new urbanists are dead serious about that. They have an idea about housing. But over the last century, housing has continually been given this load. It's got to do more. It can't just be housing. It's got to build a better world. But I think, in the end, Engels was right, as naive as he was, when he said, and granted this is a 19th century language, so rewrite it for the 20th century. He said about the inner city, East End, the breeding places of disease, the infamous holes and cellars in which the capitalist mode of production confines workers night after night, are not abolished, they are shifted elsewhere. He's talking about slum clearance. The same economic necessity which produced them in the first place produces them in the second place. As long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for an isolated settlement of the housing question or any other social question afflicting the lot of the worker. The solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production. Now, I don't want to go as far as Engels. This is an architecture school. He's just told you you have no work. But what he's saying is an important thing. I think Engels is wrong. I think the building of housing and the creation of housing is an important thing. People need it. People need it to begin to rebuild their lives. Has anybody spent time with homeless people or people who are inadequately housed? It's awful. The lack of structure that it provides, the constant fear about where you're going to sleep the next night is no fun. I mean, try to do it for 2 weeks, and you'll see how unnerving it can be and how incredibly creative people who own us and do well in the world are. They're amazing people to do that. You're fighting amazing odds. So housing is important. I'm not arguing like Engels that we shouldn't worry about it. But housing is important. That's it. Let's not make it important for any other reason than it is housing. All right? Now, housing raises, if we're going to deal with housing, though, it's not so simple. Because what's frightening to me in many ways, in the discussion about housing, in architecture schools, in my school, or maybe not here, is that while talking about the great tasks of social engineering and creating stability and better families, there's an article, there's a thing I have from the U.S. government that says if people could own housing, they're going to have better families. That explains why so many middle-class and upper-middle-class families have rates of divorce of 70%, you know. They must not own their own homes. And that's got to be the answer. There's so many important questions that we need to raise about housing that go untalked about because we're talking about, can we create better urbanism? Can we create better communities? Can we get rid of the automobile? And why anybody would think a house would get rid of the automobile in an automobile-based society like the United States is beyond me. But you know what will happen in the United States? Because I know this. I lived in a community where shops were right next to the Midwest, which is an automobile place. People drive 2 blocks. You know? You think I jest. I used to walk because I'm from New York, and I'd say, I'll meet you at the bar. These guys all get in their cars. I'd be sitting there 20 minutes because it was a gated community, too. So they had to drive all the way out of the gated community, come around the main avenue. It took them about 25 minutes. It was a 3-minute walk, but you don't walk in the United States. You got a car. Why would you want to walk? You know, you get your exercise when you go running in the morning, right? You've done your exercise. You don't need your exercise. Now you use your car, right? But the issues that, let me just raise some of the issues that surround housing today. For one, and this is from, actually I praise the English have done more work on this than just about anybody else. I think of Rex and Moore's work on housing classes, which is not necessarily correct, but at least raises the question. We have so little research on the question of whether the type and location have any important effect on people's life chances. Because one of the problems we have is, yes, we can show that people who own houses are more stable. But that's because they were middle class and upper middle class, and they were more stable when they bought the house. I mean, they are economically more stable. So there's a very difficult piece of research. Are people stable because they own? Or do they own because they live in a world which has given them some economic stability? I'm not talking about psychologically now. I'm talking about, economically stable. That's an open question. The United States, part of the new urbanist movement, and as an offshoot of it, is the great emphasis on the ownership of housing. So all housing now is to be for ownership. If we only get people to own their own houses, they'll be better people. Without any real knowledge of the relationship between ownership and any other success in life. I mean, I should have been a failure. I've never owned a house in my life. I'm 54 years old. I've lived in a single-family house once, and it made me very nervous. I didn't have neighbors. I lived, in fact, in a single-family house on 20 acres of some of the most beautiful land in Boston, the Boston area, on a promontory overlooking a beaver pond. I mean, what else? This is most people's fantasy. I did not sleep the whole time I was there. This is one of the wealthiest suburbs. A friend of mine gave me his house for a month. It's one of the wealthiest suburbs. There's no crime in Dover. It doesn't exist. I was scared stiff. This big house, dark outside, no neighbors. How can you live that way? I mean, people could sneak up on you and kill you, and nobody would know, right? Has anybody had that experience coming from big cities? You go out and it's scary, I tell you. Secondly, no one knows, and no one's ever really looked at carefully, whether the design of housing can be used to generate more housing. How useful is it to use housing as a basis to strategically plan development and to develop more housing? Or does the building of housing end after the housing is built? I go back to the thing with Michael Piatak. That's the question Michael can't answer. He can show that in the places he builds, people get involved, but he can't show that it translates into anything else. We don't know. And we don't know how to do it, but that's an important question. And that's just dealing with housing. Does housing create a new political order, new political engagement? Or does it create complacency or protectiveness on the part of the new residents? And this is in low, middle, or upper income communities. Getting a house may make you, and this was, of course, Engels' argument, make you more conservative. Engels believed that deeply, that workers should not take new housing because they would lose their working class sense of the self, and they specifically should not own their own housing because, as he pointed out, you never really own your own house until you're about 75 in the United States. The bank owns the house. Right? You do not own the house. There's another interesting issue when we're dealing with housing. What defines a household? What defines homelessness? That's something nobody wants to confront, and that's an incredibly important issue in housing. In the United States, there are many places that define a household as, well, in celebration, only 2 people in a room. Can't do threesomes in celebration. You can get arrested. I'm serious. I am dead serious. In the United States, in many communities, there's a big debate, I don't know about England, about what constitutes a proper household. Can it be someone who is not related? Many gated communities say a proper household are those who are in the nuclear family, in one ascending generation, and one unrelated person. An au pair, a maid. That's it. You cannot have any more people in the house. Now, in many societies and many cultures, that would be an absurdity, right? On its face. It's a real problem. And the question of what defines homelessness, is it merely being on the street? Or is it being in a place, which often happens, where you really cannot live a viable life? There are many people in the United States who are not technically homeless. They live with their 80-year-old parents who don't want them there. They have whole families living together with other families in a very overcrowded conditions. But that raises the question of what's overcrowded. That's my middle class standard. What defines overcrowdedness? Is it some absolute biological definition or square foot definition, or is it a social definition? Do you understand the difference? I mean, I can say overcrowdedness is that there are more, there's more than 10 people in 100 square feet or whatever. Or I can say that overcrowdedness is when people start going nutso because they're living close to too many people. And that could vary for different societies and different people. For me, I lived alone most of my life, and I live with one other person now, and it's a real, I've been doing it for 26 years, but it ain't easy. I mean, she has her own habits. That's not fair. She moves things, and that makes me very unnerved. Now, I'm being semi-facetious here, but it's a real problem when you get into large groups of people living together because economically they have no choice, but are not considered homeless because they are sitting in abode. Even if they're related, they may not want to be together, and it might not be salutary for them to be together. And there's another very important question. Is housing the problem one of insufficient or inadequate dwelling units? Or is it a problem defined by the nature of social and cultural practices associated with dwelling? One of the things that you get in many houses, you get a lot of crime, you get a lot of problems in low-income communities. Is that because of the nature of the housing? Did Pruitt-Igoe, you all know Pruitt-Igoe? God, it's amazing how generations change. Pruitt-Igoe was the example of the worst conceivable. It had the worst crime in the world. It was so dangerous the cops wouldn't go there. I'm serious, in St. Louis. They blew it up. Now, there were some problems, like they built elevators every other floor, so you had to go into stairwells which were soundproof. So if somebody wanted to rob you, nobody could hear you in the hallway, right? And there were like 20 different exits and entrances, so the police wouldn't come, A, because it was dangerous, B, because they'd never catch you. I mean, there were so many different ways of getting out of the place. All right. But when Pruitt-Igoe first started, they didn't have crime problems. When Pruitt-Igoe first started, they brought in working people, people of stable families, and they were well managed. Then they couldn't fill it all up with people like that, and part of the problem was that people from the outside started coming in and robbing. It wasn't people in the projects. So working families left because St. Louis had a lot of other possible housing alternatives for people who were working. So they put in people who were basically penniless. And as a result, and they didn't create the crime. The crime still was created from the outside, but because they were penniless groups, not only did the police not want to come in because they couldn't catch people, but they didn't want to come in because they didn't give a damn about that population in the United States. That's not a population for whom the police answer calls. Try it. You should try an experiment. You go to New York City, you call from public housing, it'll take an hour if the cops will come at all. You call in a fancy neighborhood, it can take as much as 2.5 minutes. I mean, this is real too. So are the problems of housing the problems of the design? And I'm not saying that the design of Pruitt-Igoe was great, but I'm not sure that's the reason it had the problems it did. The housing may have exacerbated what problems were created, right? But they're certainly not the cause. And I think good management could have gotten over it. There are many, many tall towers in the States that are successful. I grew up in one. I grew up in public housing. And I'm really tired of the myth that public housing fails, that, the big towers. In New York City, many of the towers worked well 30 years ago when I lived in them. They work well today. Because it is in the nature of New York to be carefully managed and deal with problems, keep them clean, keep people organized. And that's a very important part of housing. Finally, and these are just some of the questions, is housing a local issue or is it a global issue? One of the things that Neil Smith makes clear is that gentrification is a local issue at one level, but at a very important level, it is a very global issue because it has to do with the nature of investment. I mean, is it any coincidence that London and Boston are having housing, and New York have housing problems for middle income and lower income people when they've become the major financial centers in the world? You may not know this, but Boston is a major financial center. This comes as a surprise. It is actually the fourth largest financial center in the world. And so you get a lot of people with a lot of money willing to spend a lot of money on housing coming in and creating massive problems for everybody else. That doesn't mean there aren't local solutions, but it does mean that there's a kind of balance. All right, theme 3. Do I got time? Yeah, I got a little time. How am I doing? I told you it was going to be broad and shallow. I keep my promises. One of the problems we have, and I think this is, to me, as an anthropologist, the most dear one, is the extent to which, over the years, over the last 100 years, we have associated with housing, with not housing, but with certain kinds of social formations, most specifically neighborhood and community. These wonderful words that we always use. If I go to another jury where somebody gets up and says, I'm building this house to build a stronger community, my students know not to say it in front of me because they're going to fail. Because people have to start thinking about what we mean by these things. We have borrowed these terms over and over and over and over again and use it and not thinking about what does it mean. What's so hot about community? What's so hot about neighborhood? First of all, what the hell does community mean? Can anybody tell me? Give me a definition, a quick definition of community.
Unity together or collective unity according to various dimensions of human situation.
That's one definition, but it's hard to define, right? Because then you have to say, what do you mean by unity? I mean, in fact, the word has so many different definitions. There was a study done in the 1950s, and a man found over, I think, 90 definitions for the word community. The interesting thing about the definitions and the danger of the word is that community is one of the few words in the English language which does not have an opposite negative. Think about it. What is the opposite of community? Yeah, disunity, but that's not. But in a like light dark. It doesn't have that kind of It doesn't have antisocial social, but community anti-community doesn't. They don't fit. This is something Raymond Williams points out. It's a very fascinating term in the English language. It has no obvious linguistic opposite. There are conditions which you can describe as opposite of community, but it has no negative, right? Community is always good. But the question that you have to ask, and neighborhood is always good, is one, what is it and is it good? First of all, the problem, of course, is one of bounding. Where does a community begin and end? How do you define it? Especially in neighborhood. Where does a neighborhood begin and end? Anybody know? Well, I knew, and this is both the upside and downside. When I grew up in public housing, I grew up in Jacob Riis. You ever go to New York, Lower East Side, there are projects from 14th Street all the way down to 1st Street. It's almost a mile length of projects. I lived on 8th Street, the corner of 8th and FDR Drive. Across the street on 8th and FDR Drive, there was the Lillian Wald projects. Right? Well, in my world, Jacob Riis was the end of my world. I lived there 5 years. I never did anything but throw stones at kids who lived right across the street. I walked 6 blocks to my best friend who lived in Jacob Riis. That's my community. That's my neighborhood. It was a wonderful thing. There was great support. But think about it. Great support at the expense of what? Tremendous fragmentation, hatred. I hated kids from Lillian Wald. You know why? Because they were from Lillian Wald. Anybody who grows up in public housing knows about this. This is the way it is. I mean, that's reality. I grew up I moved into a middle class, upper middle class neighborhood. The neighborhood I lived in was the personification of everybody's nostalgia for the good neighborhood. The stores were small. I could walk home from school. My mother worked the whole time I was from the age of about 8 on because she didn't have to worry about babysitting. When I got home, if I was bad, one of the parents would pull me into the house and say, get in the corner until your mother comes home. right? There was always eyes on the street, the thing that Jane Jacobs talks about. I could walk home, the butcher would yell, "Come here, your mother called and said you're going to bring this home for dinner." When I got to about 12 and I could cook for myself, she'd let me go in and buy things, but she knew. I'd say, "I want 3 hot dogs," and he'd say, "No, your mother says no hot dogs. You can get manicotti, you can get this, but you can't get hot dogs." I lived in the ideal community. And it really was fun. I mean, it really was. I used to play stickball on the streets. And we had all these incredible rules. I had a field right across the street where they played baseball. We had a major field where the adults played full-time games and the kids would play between them, and there were rules about how it worked. I mean, truly, as close to the ideal description of community as I've ever heard. And I loved it. I really did enjoy growing up in it. But as I got older and I went back to it, began to see some ugly sides to it, too. It was a great community for me. But you didn't want to be Hispanic or black unless you were an errand boy. You didn't want to be different, period. You didn't want to be someone who didn't belong in the community. If you went into a bar and you did not belong in the community, you were an outsider, and there would be threatening and even violent responses to you. You did not belong. That's part of community, too. See, that's the underbelly of community nobody wants to talk about. The cohesion often comes at the expense of generosity. The cohesion is created often through some form of xenophobia, through some kind of saying, "I'm different than them. They don't belong here." So there's an underbelly to community. There's an underbelly to neighborhood that is extremely ugly. NIMBY, gated areas, are communities. I mean, everybody gets mad at gated communities, the same architects who keep talking about community. What's the difference? People who are in gated communities want community. They call them gated communities. And in many communities like mine, in my neighborhoods, the gates were not built, but they were real. So real, and this is actually true, I lived on the edge of my community. My community was Jewish. On Stratford Road is the end of the Jewish neighborhood, the beginning of the Irish neighborhood was one street over. Again, I had no friends in the Irish neighborhood. Didn't know a single Irish, I mean, I knew them, but I had nothing to do with them. Never played with them, never socialized with them. They were Irish. That's all I needed to know, right? I'm Jewish, they're Irish, this is New York of the 1950s. In fact, we didn't call them Irish and they didn't call us Jews, but I won't live the names that we used. All right? That's community too. I think it's very important to recall these kinds of things because the whole issue of what community is becomes problematic. And even in neighborhoods you have problems. In the South End today, which is a gentrifying area but which has held its working class groups as well, we have community groups you wouldn't believe. I went to a community meeting to deal with this one avenue. And there were like 40 community groups represented for an avenue that goes for like 10 miles. 25 of them were from a 10-block strip in the South End. Every block, my joke is, I always be literal, but practically floors have their own community groups because you got upper-class kids, you got lower-class people, you got new upper-class residents, you got old upper-class residents, you got new working-class residents. Each one of them have their community groups. And they come to the meetings, and they're well-organized. And because they're so well-organized, nothing ever gets done because they, And this group that did build Langham Court was one of the few groups that was trying to overcome that, was trying to find a way to say, this is insane. But that's community, too. Don't forget that. I mean, it's a very important issue, and it's an issue, it's 94 definitions. I have it written right here. That means that community can be useful, it can be positive, but it can also create tremendous problems. I think it raises a very important question, particularly in the late 20th century, whether we should use these concepts and even and borrow them and see them as supportive, because we're in a world that's increasingly fragmenting. I mean, that is true. I mean, this is a world in which parts are renting asunder in ways that no one ever... I mean, if Marx said all that solid melts into air in the 19th century, he didn't know it yet. Things were not melting so fast back then. They're melting very fast today. And these communities are getting smaller and smaller. I mean, I lived in Islington, right? How many communities in a 20-square block? I didn't realize I wasn't in Islington. I lived in the Angel. Excuse me. I wasn't in Highbury. I wasn't in Barnesbury. I was in the Angel. And I was on the Angel on the Essex side. Very important to remember that. You know, this is real. In the area of fragmentation, do we want to use this concept even? Is it helpful? Well, it may be if used with great care, but we've got to keep that in mind. But there's a more important question, and I think it's very nicely said by David Harvey, who asked or said that the presumption that neighborhoods are in some sense intrinsic and that the proper form of cities is through the planning of neighborhoods, because neighborhood is equivalent to community, and community is what we need, is open to serious question. Political and social groups can and should transcend place, particularly in a world like ours. And I agree with David Harvey. So to think that you're doing a service by building community is really an open question, is what David Harvey's saying. Now, let me turn that around. Problem is that often it is only through creating community that low-income people can get housing. Here's the rub. The way in the United States groups, low-income groups, and even middle-income groups get improvements to their neighborhoods, get improvements to their housing, is by organizing as a community group, because that's how city governments, that's how state governments respond. They don't respond to individuals, and they don't respond for housing to groups that don't have place. They don't respond to rental associations. They don't respond to those kinds of things. So they don't see them as having votes. They don't see them as having political pressure, and they don't very often, particularly in the United States where, voting is very local. So that there is, again, a kind of problem that often the best way to get housing going is through using the notion of community. But the conundrum or the problem is that often once you have the community, it becomes a kind of brake to further kinds of cooperation. It is something in the United States, I suspect in England too, that community groups are finally becoming aware of. And for that reason, many community groups in the United States, CDCs, community development corporations, are beginning to say housing is only one part of a larger development strategy. And the larger development strategy is what's going to bring jobs, what's going to bring health facilities, going to bring cultural facilities to the poorer areas. And they're not saying to their area, they're saying to the poorer areas. They're beginning to realize to do this, you've got to reach out, because community groups can bring housing, but community groups on their own singly cannot bring large-scale development for the underprivileged, to the poor, to those who need economic help. And so they're beginning to say, we've got to begin to ally. And when you ally, housing becomes a secondary problem, right? Because each neighborhood has different housing needs. And you begin to see the issue as development, of which housing and each community's needs plays a secondary role. I think that's a very healthy move. The problem is, it's just starting and no one knows quite how to do it. Finally, the last problem I want to talk about with community is a very real one if you work with community development groups. The nature of CDC, I know this is the United States, the problem with CDCs is that even though they're community-based, after a while they cease to represent the community. Do you have that problem here too? Why? Because in many areas, most neighborhoods in American cities are dynamic. And community development groups tend to be less dynamic than the neighborhoods they're a part of. So the leadership of those groups often remain while the inhabitants of the community turn over and change. So even the word community becomes muddied. I've been in situations where people in the community have told me the community group doesn't represent the community. I always say, well, let's get a better language for that. Why don't you just say they don't represent you and get rid of the word community and let's start over. Because there is that problem. All right. You said an hour. I'm almost done. I'm very good at this. George said I had to talk for an hour. No less, no more. Or he's going to beat me. Ironically, this leads to my last conclusion. One of the things that it's interesting to note that most, with some exceptions, large-scale housing proposals have paid more attention to the house, and even though they've built the environment around it, they've paid less attention. I mean, even from Corbu's plan, there's the plan, but there's not much attention for all that stuff in between. My feeling is that even though I'm saying that community is not important, what is important in housing is the residential environment. And why am I going to say this? It's going to sound strange. The house can be as conventional as it be. In fact, in many ways, the more conventional a house is, the more usable it is by most people. I had a student that did a study, it was one of Hobrocken students, and I said, well, let's not do all that shifting around. See if you can do it another way. And he went out And he figured out in the United States that if you built in public housing a least dimension of 12 feet 2 inches and put the stairs in the right place and made the windows 30 inches high off the ground, any room could be used for any purpose by any group of people. So you didn't have to call it a 2-bedroom apartment. You just say it's 4 rooms. Do what you want, right? 6 rooms. He did it by looking at furniture that people could conventionally buy. He looked at the heights, the widths, beds, desks, all sorts of things. He then discovered that in talking to people in public housing, where does the real problem lie? If they can manage their own house, which people can do if the dimensions are right, and conventional, and most people don't like unconventional houses. This may come as a surprise to architects. In fact, I have this grand belief that most architects don't like unconventional housing, because every time I visit an architect, they always live in some Edwardian or Victorian or, in Denmark, they live in the older parts of the Tafelragene, which was built by Scottish railroad workers in the 1850s. This is serious. Some of those famous architects in Denmark who do these extraordinarily modern housing live in these teeny little houses built by a bunch of Scots workmen who came to build a railroad. Lovely little houses, Anyways, what people can't control is the areas between. What people need to be able to negotiate well is how the houses fit with each other, given the context in which the houses are being put. You notice some of the best housing I showed you was very conscious of that. Backyards for kids to play in different ways in different communities. Different things about the street. Turk Street has shops below. Turk Street is a Chinese area where small shops still are very important in San Francisco. So thinking about that becomes a very central issue in any design of housing. The house is not the problem. In fact, if you show studies of people buying houses, do you know the most important reason people buy houses, at least in the United States? You know where the house type comes in a ranking? First is location. And what do they mean by location? How accessible is it to transportation? How accessible is it to good schools? How accessible is it to good shops? What does the neighborhood feel like and look like? And only after all those questions are asked, then people begin to say, I like this house over that house type. And most people in the United States, if given a bad location and a good location, a wonderful house type they love in a bad location and a not so great house in a good location, will almost invariably pick the good location. They'll live with a bad house. You can change it, it's not that big a deal. But your neighborhood, in the sense of who you live with, how it articulates with other houses, how you can make sense of it, how your kids can play in it, what it feels like, is something you cannot control. So that is where I think the creativity of architects building housing has to come in. So it seems to be an ironic statement after I said about neighborhood. But you don't have to think about it as neighborhood. I'm not talking about making a community. I mean, one of the things I loved about living in New York is you got great neighbors. Where I live today, I have great neighbors. They lend me their car. They'll take care of my house. People come to my house when I'm gone and they don't know who they are. They'll ask them, what the hell are you doing? If they got the key. I always have to tell them, so-and-so is going to be coming to take care of my house. But we don't socialize. We don't work as a community. We're just good neighbors, right? Just polite and decent. But we have no great definition. Our area doesn't have a name. And we don't do anything with each other. Why? Because, in fact, we know, given our differences in backgrounds, that if we try to be a community, that would be the end of good neighborliness in this fact. I live in a house in Cambridge where it's way below market rent because it's owned by an old socialist who doesn't believe in charging market rents. People across the street from me make considerably more money. One of them is a Roosevelt. That's like having a relative of Diana across the street in American terms. You understand the thing? She didn't think like I do. She doesn't have the same politics I have. We get along fine. She's a lovely person. But if we try to become a community, we'd be in deep trouble. I mean, her house cost $1 million. I pay $1,500 a month, right? Got the difference? Significant difference. Right there. Anyways, she drives a brand new Volvo. I don't got a car. Well, we have some problems. Anyways. But it's the fact that the residential environment is done in a way that allows people to live nicely together without intruding on each other, that allows people to see each other because of the way the backyards and the front yards are configured, that people see each other in winter. In winter, we don't see each other. This is Boston. In summer, people see each other, is important. It's an important part of creating a nice place to live overall. All right, it's an hour. Go look. Let me conclude. I'm not done yet. Wait. I got 30 seconds. I may be sounding a bit conservative. I'm raising these issues because I think they're things we've got to talk about and think about in the housing world. I think a lot of people are, but I thought I'd bring them all together in one place to inaugurate this series. And hopefully these issues, and they probably will, come up over and over again. I want to conclude by sounding a bit conservative, which is strange for me because I've never seen myself as a conservative. But hey, get to a certain age, they warn you about that when you're younger, right? I was the generation that don't trust anybody over 30, and I'm significantly over 30, so I've ceased to trust myself. Anyways, housing is too big a problem to have to deal with larger social issues at the same time. Housing is too big a problem to worry just about the house. Even if we agree that, and I certainly believe that there is much to be done about the social issues in our cities, and I basically work with groups to do that. I don't work predominantly in housing. I still think, and I will use a sentence that Ernesto Alva Martinez, who is a very interesting architect in Mexico and is head of their housing group now in Infonavit, in the social housing area. Extraordinary man, has worked in Cuba and Chile. But he always tells people, as much as he is devoted to building housing, he always ends by saying, you have to remember, housing is a problem. It is not the problem. Thank you.